Well, on to news relating to the Guptas. Now, the latest report from amaBhungane and Scorpio shows how the Guptas facilitated Transnet's substitution of a Japanese locomotive with a Chinese one. The Guptas and their cronies at Transnet allegedly pulled off a 4.8 billion rand bait and switch on the foreign company. Now, investigative journalist Susan Comrie is here to tell us more on this story. Good evening, Susan. Thanks very much for coming through. So between 2013 and 2014, the Guptas redirected 100 locomotive deal from one manufacturer, which was Japan's Mitsui, across to South China Rail.
Yeah, I mean, this contract was it was a precursor to the massive 1064 contract.
Yes.
It was 100 locomotives, and it was for Transnet to sort of fill a gap that they had, where they had certain locomotives retiring and they needed new trains. Now, the technical experts at Transnet had recommended sort of extending a contract that already existed with Mitsui, a Japanese manufacturer, but they had a well-established local plant, and they were manufacturing a large part of those locomotives were being manufactured locally.
And they had local partners.
They had local partners. You know, it was a well-established, well-known thing. So the Transnet engineers had asked for this request and had said, let's go ahead. Now, what you can see from the documents that we were able to find is that saga supported this request and took it forward. Then there's a sort of a derailment that happens, for lack of a better word, where you suddenly have a business partner of Salim Essers, who is on the board of Transnet.
Okay, before we get there, just for a second, just where you were talking about saga, right? So is that the basis on which we assume, or is there more evidence, that in fact Mitsui was the preferred bidder, or were the preferred people to supply the 100 locomotives?
Well, we can see, I mean, we have the documents. We can see, and that was actually in the Gupta leaks, you could see that there was a formal proposal which was taken to the board with a massive justification of saying why we should go this route. It is an unusual route. You know, it's a route that's not going on an open tender process. So there was room to argue that perhaps that wasn't the way to go. What effectively happens, though, is that you have that argument being made, but it's really just as a pretext in order to then take that same contract, literally cut and paste, take out Mitsui, put in China South Rail, then the same contract gets delivered over to the Gupta partners. And what we know from the Gupta leaks, which has been very helpful for us, is that the Guptas, Salim Esser and their partners had already negotiated a sort of, for lack of a better word, a kickback, a 21% commission. So they had promised, we'll get you this contract, and in exchange they were going to get around 900 million rand for doing that.
Okay, slowly, right? What exactly did the Guptas do using who?
Well, so that's really what we've been focusing on with this series of stories that we've been doing, is we knew that there were these commissions that were negotiated. We wanted to understand what was done in order to earn that commission. Now, earn is a little bit of a loose term, but what we can see in this case is that you have a sort of close ally of theirs introducing this idea of we shouldn't go with this confinement, it's problematic, it's not in terms of the PFMA. He seems to have gone to the DG at the time, Tsadisa Matona, and raised these queries with him. Now,
the DG of Public Enterprises. Of
Public Enterprises. Now, what Matona knew or didn't know is very difficult to know. He sort of seems to give a kind of sort of preliminary, well, yeah, I agree, you know, if there are questions about how this has been procured, then maybe we should think twice. That seems to be enough that the deal was taken off the table, that suddenly the 100 locomotives and the idea of confining it to Mitsui in sort of October 2013, that suddenly disappears. Now what happens, the interesting part, is that you suddenly see the same deal being revived in January 2014. And it's literally a cut and paste job, except none of the objections which were raised at the time about Mitsui are in the new proposal. Again, it's a confinement. It's now a confinement, though, to a company which didn't have an off-the-shelf design. They had to design a new locomotive. And interestingly, what you see is when the proposal is revived in January, you have then CEO Brian Molefe writing the proposal. And in that, he says, well, you know, the reason we shouldn't give it to Mitsui is because the media has raised questions about the sort of political connections of Mitsui's BEE partners. Now, you know, they say, well, we would never award a contract on the basis of political connections, but we should keep this in mind. Now, obviously, knowing now what we know about Brian Molefe's connections to the Guptas, knowing what we know about Iqbal Sharma's connections to the Guptas, it seems quite ironic that that's what they use to take the contract away from Mitsui and then award it to their favored partners in China.
Now, Brian Molefe at this point was what? The CEO
yes.
of Transnet.
Yeah.
And Iqbal Sharma, what was his role?
So he was the head of the Board Acquisitions and Disposals Committee, which is a sort of powerful committee within the Transnet board, which would kind of be looking at all of these massive procurements of locomotives that were happening. I mean, to be honest, this is why we've really gone back to this contract, is, you know, there's been so much focus on Eskom, and the capture of Eskom was massive. But when you compare it to Transnet, by far the biggest heist the Guptas are alleged to have pulled off is with regards to train contracts at Transnet. And we really wanted to go back there and sort of unpick, you know, the figures that we're talking about, 5 billion rand channeled into offshore entities, are just astounding. And when one looks at the impact on the local industry, it's been absolutely massive.
Hence your title, The Great Train Robbery. Now, both gentlemen, I understand, claim that they did nothing wrong. All they did, or their respective roles were above board.
Sure. I mean, as you know, as with a lot of the things that we've investigated with Transnet and with Eskom, you know, taken in isolation, an action that they may have taken doesn't seem necessarily problematic. When one starts to put all of the pieces of the puzzle together, one can see that there was a concerted and what looks like a coordinated effort to move this contract from one supplier to another. What we see that in the process, you have the price of the locomotives going up quite substantially by sort of R1 billion. And you also see, you know, questions being raised about the kind of job creation that would have happened, job retention that would have happened had the locomotives been manufactured locally. Instead, you know, most of those locomotives were unfortunately made in China. And as one of our sources had quite sort of cleverly put it, you know, we're effectively importing other people's unemployment when we do that.
Oh. But the locomotives were eventually delivered?
Yes. Yes, the locomotives, there hasn't been an issue there. The locomotives were delivered. You know, this was the three major contracts that we're looking at, the 95, the 100, and then the next big one, which we'll be turning our attention to, which was the massive 1064, over 1,000 locomotives, which was split between 4 different manufacturers.
And when all that, or after all that had happened, we know that the Guptas pocketed 942 million. Is that the amount?
Well, that's really just on that's on one contract. That's on the 100 locomotive contract. When one adds what we know, the commissions that they had negotiated from those 3 different contracts, just from one supplier, from China South Rail, it gets to around 5.3 billion that they had negotiated, which is an astounding amount of money. And when you think about it, you know, that price has to be added on to what Transnet ultimately pays. So it's money that we've sent offshore into Hong Kong.
Indeed. The Great Train Robbery, Part 2. Susan Comrie, thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
She is, of course, from amaBhungane. You can get the full report on their website, amaBhungane.co.za.